So please help me and welcome Philip.
Thank you so much for coming. As you know, I'm just the warm-up act, right? So the real headliner is later on, Peter. So
I will
just
give you a different version.
So just relax, chill out. You know, just as like the first band, just to get you in the mood. And I'll be talking about the aim of Frege's Logicist project. It is scholarly, so again, sort of relax, listen to sort of some ideas that I have about this, and I'm sure, some of the stuff will hopefully be leading to some good discussion later on. Right, so what I'll do, so just in case you find yourself, suddenly waking up in the middle of a Frege talk, I'll give you a rough outline of what I'm going to do, so you know where you are when you wake up. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to briefly give you the problem or paradox of analysis and how it applies to Frege and what the state of play of that is with respect to Frege's scholarship. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to outline sort of some of the problems, just going to sort of allude to them. I'm not going to really develop them in too much detail. Problems for the standard views about this. And then my main aim later on in this presentation is, in a way, to discuss a bunch of arguments that were used against what's called the term-by-term reference preservation view. And wild guess, that's the view that I want to go for. So I'm going to try and sort of defend this. I'm not going to really establish this, but I'm just going to say a couple of things against these kind of arguments that have really been used very, very quickly to push that view aside. The other thing that I should say is the minimal aim sort of in terms of Frege scholarship, what I really want to get into, make people aware of, is that I think the issue about arbitrariness that is a really important issue in Frege scholarship. And sort of it has been sort of discussed in the 70s, it died out, so the minimal aim of this talk is to get people talking about this again, and then actually sort of defend, as I said, an interpretation of Frege that was all too quickly rejected on the basis of arbitrariness considerations. Okay. I mentioned for you just to relax and chill out, so I'm going to just invite you to actually think, imagine this impossible world where basic law 5 is totally fine, we don't have any problems. I probably wouldn't have a job because everything's sort of, sorted out. I know it's difficult to imagine this, but, I just invite you to.
I can't get my head around it, sorry.
and just think like everything is fine, about actually everything worked in Frege. And now the question is, what has he actually achieved? Okay, let's just assume everything worked out. What is it that he has actually done? And what will sort of be one of the problems once you approach Frege from that perspective is that his view is a reductionist view. So what is proclaimed in is that he wants to reduce arithmetical truths to logical truths, and he wants to do that in such a way that he gives, through the logical truths, gives you some kind of foundation of these arithmetical truths. So it's a reductionist project, and pretty much any reductionist project will face what we call the problem of analysis. The question is, how tightly are the analysandum and the analysans connected? And it seems that as a kind of adequacy constraint, when do we stop with our reduction? There are two kind of criteria that push us in two different kind of directions. On the one hand, you want a kind of synonymy. On the one hand, you want that the analysans and the analysans should be expressing at least roughly the same thought. Right? If they weren't, what have you done? It's completely different kind of things that you're talking about. Now, importantly, that's especially important if you want to give an epistemic foundation. And Frege is crystal clear about that. He says over and over again that the aim of his project is to do what? Is to give you an insight into the epistemic nature of arithmetical truths by reducing it to logic. So you want to get something like that. On the other hand, of course, you want to also that the analysis is somehow informative. It tells you something new. If I told you that 2 plus 2 is 4, and I reduce it to the statement that 2 plus 2 is 4, I haven't really done anything. Okay? So there has to be something informative here. The problem in Frege is, I think the problem in Frege is that you have a problem with both of these. Okay? So think about this. If Frege is actually correct, and you have to start with the arithmetical truth, 1 is a successor of 0, and you want to reduce that to a logical truth, namely the way he does it, you end up with a statement like this. For some concept F and some concept A, falling under F, the extension of the concept equinumerous with the concept identical with the extension of the concept equinumerous with the concept not separate, and so on. Synonymy? Informativeness? Really? What are you getting out of this? This is crazy. By the way, I'm not 100% sure I got this right, so do it homework. By the end of this talk, and if you could check that this is actually the correct way of doing this, that would be great.
Wait,
So,
what is it? You want to know just if these are synonymous?
yeah.
Is that what you're
No,
asking?
is that actually...
Among other things.
Amongst other things. No.
You want to know if this is what Frege
Just the definition that Frege actually gives that this actually is the correct way of thinking about it. I think it is.
You're the expert here.
Yeah. So, thanks. Can I have that in mind? Excellent. So, you can see, so in terms of synonymy, I mean, maybe you'll stare at this for a day or two, and then you say, well, that's obvious. But there's a lot of work here to be done. This is providing somehow the foundation for this kind of statement. So, this is the challenge of Frege, and it's not quite clear what he actually says in response to this kind of, what actually his aim really was by providing this kind of definition. So, what's the state of play? What are the kind of answers that you get in response to this? Well, here are 4 views, and I'm going to distinguish 4 of them. The first one is sort of a kind of classic conception that the aim of analysis actually, especially for Frege, to provide a kind of term-by-term sense preservation. So arithmetical statements are analyzable into logical statements by providing term-by-term sense-preserving analysis. So you focus on substantial parts, and then you go into them and provide term-by-term sense-preserving analysis, as Frege has done, and then apply that to it. And of course, if you build it up, it might actually end up quite complicated, but that's what you do. That's where you start. Another view is just reference preservation. So what actually Frege wanted to do, he didn't care about actually the sense of arithmetical 1 being the same as something, whatever he defines it in logic. All he wanted to do is that actually he wanted to tell you that's what it actually refers to. They might have different senses, but they have the same reference. So arithmetical statements are analyzable into logical statements, but providing term-by-term reference preserving analysis. These 2 views seem very much compatible and well suited with a broadly Platonist interpretation of Frege. Especially on this one, of course, you kind of get sense preservation, term-by-term sense. It really, really nicely works out. On this one, you kind of, well, we'll talk a little bit more exactly how good it is actually as a foundation at the end. Okay. Now, what are the other 2 views? Well, I mean, obviously, the one thing that I should say is you reject this kind of view, you also, of course, reject this kind of view. If reference isn't preserved, sense can't be preserved, but you can, of course, have different kinds of senses, but the same kind of reference that the term refers to. So any arguments against the reference preservation view will also be an argument against the sense preservation. The alternative, or the other 2 views that are out there, are where you move this level up. So what you're now trying to preserve, the preservation takes place on the level of sentences, not on the level of substantial expression. So the thought is thought preservation. Certain basic arithmetical statements are analyzable into logical statements by providing thought-preserving analysis without thereby securing term-by-term sense preservation. You've got to have a certain kind of view about compositionality for this to actually sort of be interesting. This is Patricia Blanchette's view, and a lot of this actually is sort of a discussion of Patricia's paper and book, which is fantastic for anyone who wants to read this. And then the last one, of course, is the truth preservation. All you do is for a true arithmetical statement, they're analyzable into true logical statements by providing truth preservation. It's a kind of replacement science. That's the view that Benacerraf has argued for. That's how we should read Frege. And that's a view that, you know, if you end up with that, it's really questionable what kind of reduction have you actually produced. So those are the 4 layers. And before I'm going to quickly go and delve into them and argue for and against a couple, a very, very quick interlude. What I looked at right now was the kind of situation situation where you take sort of our everyday arithmetical language, you try to precify it and give it sort of its analysis and logic. There's a kind of an analogous problem, sort of intra-mathematical problem, where you actually look at alternative reconstruction of arithmetic and how they are actually connected to each other. And Frege has some really interesting thoughts about this. So, for example, Frege says this about Weierstrass and others: how little value is commonly placed on sense and definitions can be seen from the sharply conflicting accounts that mathematicians give of what number is. Each of these, Weierstrass, Heine, and Thome, attaches a different sense to the word number. So the arithmetic of these three mathematicians must be quite different. How can one possibly imagine that quite different sciences should really have the same content? Is it only because they are called arithmetic and treat of numbers? Although what is called a number in one is quite different from what is called a number in the other? Or is it not the explanation, rather, that we have really to do with the same science? That this man does attach substantially the same sense to the word number as the man, only doesn't quite succeed in grasping it correctly. Okay. So this is the kind of passage which sort of indicates there are these kind of problems also intra-mathematical with these different kind of reconstruction.
Philip, where's that from?
1914, I think that's Logik in der Mathematik. Another nice quote, what use 100,000 theorems if we ourselves don't know what we want to communicate by their means, if the one who uses the theorem attaches a different thought to it than the one who first proved it. So I'm going to just leave this there because I'm going to come back to this as a kind of interview. So what's the setup? How do I want to proceed from now on? I'm just going to take it that the last kind of option, the truth preservation view, that's kind of difficult to square with Frege's pronounced aim. It's just not going to give you a proper epistemic foundation. You've got to tell some kind of big story why this completely different theory, right, where you have truth preservation, but nothing more, no connection in content or even subject matter, somehow gives you a foundation. Another whole talk would be on thought preservation, which is Patricia's talk. So I'm going to sort of put that aside too. I'm just going to assume these are sort of our backup options. Let's just try to push the first two views. I'm going to give you a brief overview of sense preservation view and raise a couple of challenges, and then discuss the arguments against reference preservation. Okay. So, what is actually turn-by-turn sense preservation? So some people in this room might know Ebert better than me, but the view roughly is something like this. So this is Ebert's interpretation of Frege. Frege regarded his logicist elaboration of ordinary arithmetical discourse as revealing the senses that arithmetical expression had been expressing all along. Okay? So this is actually what the aim is. If you go back to the quote that I just had of Weierstrass, there's something very similar. Okay? So he actually really gets in and tries to figure out what it really is they have been expressing all along. It's just that some people had not quite a complete grasp of this. Okay. So I think it actually sits well with a number of passages in Frege, and I'm going to give you two of those. The first one is in Grundlagen, and this is these beautiful metaphors that he uses on a couple of in a couple of places. So he writes, what one calls history of concept is thus either history of our knowledge of concepts or of the meaning of words. By means of great intellectual labor, which may often continue for centuries, we succeed in coming to know a concept in its purity by peeling off its foreign covers, which concealed it from the intellectual eye. So basically what we had to do, we just had a very incomplete understanding of what the notion of one actually means. And we just have to peel away all this kind of stuff that we impose on it, intuition, everything, put it all away, go in there and really find out about its logical nature. Another beautiful passage is this one. If you really do have a clear grasp of the sense of the simple sign, then it cannot be doubtful whether it agrees with the sense of the complex expression. That's exactly in a way, the problem of the analysis here. If this is open to question, then the reason must lie in the fact that we do not have a clear grasp of the sense of the simple sign, but that its outlines are confused as if we saw it through a mist. This is this sort of beautiful metaphor in Frege often has this kind of misty understanding. It's like a fog. You see it through a fog. The sense is out there, but you can't quite see it and you try to clean it all up. So that would be a solution to the problem of analysis. Right? In fact, what you have is thought, so you have synonymy. Why is it informative? Well, because it took you a lot of work to actually get it, to really realize what those terms actually meant. Okay, so that is actually what we have to do. So before that, we just attached the kind of not right kind of sense to it, and now I'm going to get in there and really clean it up for you. And that's when we have thought preservation, we have sense preservation, term by term sense preservation, and we get this kind of informative. Now there are a bunch of problems with this. It's a beautiful metaphor, but it's always a problem with metaphors. Don't usually quite work that well. So there are a number of, I'm not going to go through all of them here. There's a nice paper by Nelson in 2008, and he puts pressure on our notion of thought identity. Because it now seems kind of difficult to really know, to tell that, we're successful. If it's so externalist, what does it mean suddenly? Okay, now I got it, right? What's that mark? Because, well, we've been misunderstanding it the whole time, right? The next one is, this is a general problem. I think that's a big problem for philosophy of language. How do these statements actually get the sense that they have? It's so far away from any kind of practice or anything. It's just out there that you have to kind of get. It's very difficult for Frege to tell some kind of story. So I'm going to go for the polemic response here, because just to make it quick. Of course, it has some kind of strange consequences that view as well, right? Most competent speakers fail to understand properly, fully sentences of the form 3 is greater than 2. Neither did Weierstrass. And by the way, Frege was, of course, the first one to actually fully grasp it. And that kind of sounds a little bit pretentious, and a little bit problematic, But hey, fair enough. There's another problem I think that I think is my former colleague Walter Pedriali has raised about this kind of Misty understanding view. I'll just raise this as well because I think it's a nice consideration. Kind of misunderstanding, according to this account, is understanding of partial content. But if senses only contain logical material, and if, as seems clear, senses are individuated purely in virtue of those features, then leaving out essential logical features of a given sense entails that anything can only grasp part of that sense is in fact getting hold of another sense. And missing out part of the sense, that is, we're in fact missing out essential marks. That makes the sense it is. That is to say, any variation of its apprehended profile of a sense entails differences in the meaning. So if that is a rough, a good sketch and a good kind of argument, what kind of means that it's really difficult to make sense of the distinction on that kind of view, burgeoning view of Frege, between confusedly thinking about the right sense and not confusedly thinking about the wrong sense. So these are kind of the sort of challenges that the sense preservation view has. And again, I wouldn't say one really is definitely the sort of knockdown one. I just find it kind of counterintuitive that this is actually what Frege wanted. I think Frege probably merely wanted to go for a kind of reference preservation. The kind of concerns, some of those that I mentioned beforehand, I think can be avoided if we go with reference preservation. So to rephrase Burge, what would that mean? Frege regarded his logicist elaboration of ordinary arithmetical discourse as revealing the references of arithmetical expressions, references that had been expressing all along. Okay, so why would that be a good interpretation? I think it would kind of work as sort of fit with a number of passages where Frege talks about his aim in the Logicist project. I'm going to again briefly mention one or two of those in the next paragraph. And it would also kind of make sense of the debate with the other mathematicians, right? They've been always talking about the same kind of objects, but actually they've been kind of confused about really what the sense was. But at least they had something in common. Maybe they talked about the same kind of subject. So here are a bunch of quotations, and this is sort of grinding my own axe. So this is a paper that I wrote in 2016. I think 99% of all Frege scholars probably disagree, and I'm that 1% on the other side who agrees with me. But this is the kind of view where I try to actually suggest that maybe in Frege, in Grundlagen, Frege had also already something like a sense-reference distinction. And so I'm going to sort of impose that on this, as you can challenge me on this, of course. But basically, this, what I'm giving you here, this passage, is the first sentence of the Grundlagen. This is how he opens up the Grundlagen. And he opens up the Grundlagen with the question: if we raise the question what the number 1 is, or what the sign 1 bedeutet, he writes, right? You will most often receive the answer, well, a thing. And if you know that the sentence the number 1 is a thing is not a definition, but merely states that the number 1 belongs to the realm of things, yet not which one it is, you may perhaps be asked to choose something that you want to call 1. If, however, everyone had the right to comprehend with this saying whatever he wants, then the same sentence about 1 would bedeut something different for different people. There would be no common content for such sentences. I'm much more reading this on the reference level rather than the sense level. He's really aiming to show it's about the kind of objects that you're homing in on. So, you know, challenge me on this in the question if you make this. So, there's another quote, and this is actually, I find this also really striking quote, sort of rereading Grundlagen in the kind of context of this debate about the problem of analysis. Frege gives his definition of numbers in terms of extensions of concepts. And after he gives it, the very, very first thing that he says in response is this: that this explanation applies will initially perhaps not be obvious. Don't we think of extensions of concepts to be something very different? So here he raises the question about the subject matter. Like, so you thought the number 1 was a thing, and now I'm going to tell you, is this actually that thing? That's kind of surprising, right? So it seems really the aim here for Frege was to really get into that, to really identify what is it that we've actually been referring to. So 2 suggestive kind of places where it seems he's more or less aiming after sense, reference preservation, or try to identify what we're actually referring to. So it would work if we had a view like this, you know, what remains always stable in all these debates are the objects. Our conceptions might change. So before Frege, we used concepts or senses that were in some sense defective. They were not yet fully analyzed. But depending on the view, we kind of was probably sufficient to pick out the relevant kind of objects. We could have talked about the same kind of thing. And what is logical analysis? The aim of it is, let's assume everything worked out. It is, in a way, will there be to articulate precisely what that sense is? Well, why? In order to dispel any ambiguity in what objects we actually refer to when we use mathematical vocabulary. That's the aim. So we can now resolve the various things about the discussion with Weierstrass and others. We can avoid some of the kind of concerns that you might have, and I have to tell you that, you know, none of you really understand what the word 1 means. So it seems to be sort of a nice kind of general picture. So you might wonder, hey, why don't we just stop here? Great, it's a nice view, everything's good. What's the problem? Actually, I'll tell you the problem in a second, but before I'm going to tell you what the problems are, and I think there are actually quite a few of them that I'm going to quickly go through, is you might wonder, hey, why? I mean, Berge, you know, I mean, he knows his Frege, right? And there's Patricia Blanchette, there's Benasser, why does everyone have, about the most fundamental thing of Frege's project, what was he actually trying to do? Such massively different interpretations. What's behind this? You don't really want. And I mean, one thing to say about this, I mean, Frege was aware of the problem. He actually raised it in a letter to Husserl, and they had a discussion about it. Okay. So it's not as if he was sort of oblivious to that kind of problem. Why are there so many different solutions? I actually think that Frege probably changed his mind about these confused. And I think that they have a bit of a gripe. Sometimes sort of interpreters sort of pick various different parts from Frege all over his sort of 50 years and put it all into one view. I think sometimes it's quite good to really separate these things. People do change their mind. I change my mind all the time. I'm sure Frege did as well, especially after realizing that a lot of it doesn't work. You know. So why are these? I think there might have been. So Bini and I think also Dummett suggests that Frege's view changed from earlier Frege, who adopted more kind of sense preservation view, but it's sort of a bit unclear because he didn't yet have the sense reference distinction very early on, to the middle Frege, who adopted reference preservation, and then maybe there was a kind of no-solution in 1914 in Logik und der Mathematik. So there are some people who suggest sort of Frege is quite Knapian in 1914, which might not be that surprising. Kant actually said in those lectures in 1914. So my view is pretty much this. I think the reference preservation view is a view that he aimed for, at least in Grundgesetze. And I think that was actually probably one of the things that he gave up on later on in Logik und der Mathematik. And I now have to reread some of the passages that I had earlier and say more about that discussion. So where are we at? There's some challenges for the sense preservation view. At least the reference preservation view seems to fit with the overall project. Nice Platonism as well, if you're that kind of person who wants to think of Frege as a Platonist, as I do. Fits really well with a number of passages in Grundgesetz. You kind of get a kind of foundationalism outlet out of this. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is arbitrariness. Okay. So this is a problem that's been raised in a paper by Blanchette, Frege, the last Logicist, played a very, very important role in actually influencing a number of interpretations, I think, of Weiner's and a number of other people's interpretation, and is also at the heart of Patricia's rejection of the view. If arbitrariness is a problem, it will also be a problem against the sense preservation view. So I'm going to try and convince you that some of the reasons that people are given when they draw on arbitrariness are not so bad. We can actually deal with this. As I said, it's somewhat problematic, so I'm going to partly draw on quite general considerations, but hopefully you can bear with me. I think, so there are three problems, and then there's this horrible fourth problem that I'm going to postpone to the very end when it's nearly finished, but we have to talk about the fourth problem. So the first three, so this is Blanchett's first observation, when the first time he raised this. He writes, I should like to point to two passages in which it seems clear that for arithmetic at least, Frege did not expect even references to be preserved by its definitions. The first is a footnote to the definition of the number which belongs to the concept f as the extension of the concept equanimous to the concept f. In that footnote, Frege writes, I believe that for extensions of the concept, we could simply write concept. And then later on, unfortunately, he writes this, I attach no decisive importance to bringing in the extensions of concepts at all. It's like, wait a minute, Philip, haven't you just said, he reduces it to the extensions of concepts or later value ranges, and now he writes this is actually not important what they really are. There's extensions of concepts or concepts, who cares? Surely that's not compatible with the reference preservation concept. It seems like there are different kinds here. And he doesn't care about what he's reducing it to. So this is Blanchett's conclusion. Thus, in precisely this context, the one most critical for determining whether you require definitions to preserve reference, Frege backs off and allows that different definitions providing different reference, not bringing in the extensions of concept at all. Might have done as well. The moral is inescapable. Not even reference needs to be preserved. I mean, it is puzzling. He really just writes it. There's always this kind of view about Frege that he was always crystal clear. I'm not so sure. There's a lot of fudging around, and I had earlier this quote as well, with substantially the same sense. Well, come on, same sense or not same sense? Substantially the same sense. What is it? And this is like, not decisive. Like, it's not that important. I mean, anyways, I guess maybe that's progress in philosophy that we get clear in the fudges. Here's a second point by Blanchette. The clearest indication that Frege did not intend turn-by-turn reference preservation is that he takes there to be a certain amount of arbitrariness involved in the assignment of reference to the numerical terms of the language of Grundlagen and Grundgesetz. Though the numeral 0 is taken in Grundlagen to refer to a particular extension, they are alternatives, equally good ways of settling this reference, even, it seems, one that takes a number to refer to something that is not an extension. So that's, again, the first problem, but let's leave the first problem aside. There seems to be arbitrariness in which extension it really is. How can you really think that there's reference preservation if there's this kind of arbitration? And the third observation, which is Blanchette's second observation, is that she writes the following: further evidence that Frege is not interested in reference preservation to apply to numerals is a difference between the Grundlagen and Grundgesetz analysis. So she makes a really big deal about this, and she was the first one to really push this line. I think it's really interesting. In the earlier account, numerals refer to the extension of second-level functions, while the latter technically meter account has them referring to extensions of value ranges of first-level functions. Frege gives no indication of having changed his mind about the right reference of the numerals, and seems to view the change simply as one of technical convenience. So you're telling me again, Philip, if he was really interested in reference preservation, he once gives this definition and he gives another definition, and clearly these are kind of not the same kind of definition. How can that be? So let me try and say a couple of things. And the first thing that I want to do is sort of distinguish the kinds of arbitrariness that we have involved here. I think we should distinguish the kind of arbitrariness. That's sort of Vanessa's first kind of concern, that Frege assigns little importance to identifying numbers with extensions or value ranges, or with concepts quite generally. So that's the kind of, why, I don't really care what kind it is. Then there's this observation that actually Frege's definition seems to be compatible with slightly different alternative extensions that do equally well. So that's the alternative extension of arbitrariness. And lastly, there's a kind of definitional arbitrariness. The actual definitions that he gives are very different in Grundlagen and Grundgesetz. That seems to be problematic because he just didn't really care. So let's say something. So against kind arbitrariness. So I think there are two responses you can give on behalf of Frege to this. The first one is a suggestion by Hegg. I think it's actually already in Birch. I think Birch mentioned something very, very similar. Frege later on in 1892 has this paper and this discussion of the concept horse, where he seems to think that the concept and the extension of the concept are actually interchangeable, since they refer to the same thing, that is the concept extension. So he has it, if you have a definite article, it has to be a singular term, so it actually has to refer to an object, but it says the concept. So what is he actually referring to? Well, one solution, Frege's solution, would be to say, well, he's actually there, actually referring to the extension of that concept. Okay. The language so leads us astray. Now, if you actually take that observation seriously, then what he says in Grundlagen, that's just an issue about paraphrasing. Because now he says, well, look, of course I can say the concept, because what it actually refers to is the extension of the concept. When I say. So his laissez-faire attitude in that section as to whether it should be extension of concept or concept, right, is explained actually by the deeper conviction that the notion of, about the distinction between the notion of concept and extension of concept, that actually doesn't find it yet in Grundlagen, but there's actually quite a lot of debate. May and Hegg have some nice papers about how Frege's notion of concept was actually already maybe in Grundlagen. And I think actually that's some of the discussion. So it's just an issue about paraphrasing when he says that. It's not any ontological claim. You can just paraphrase it away. But what you're actually referring to is this thing. If you don't like that, I think there's an alternative suggestion. This is sort of, again, sort of sitting back and looking at it slightly more historically as a scholar. Don't mistake someone's uncertainty about the kinds of objects for an acceptance of arbitrariness. I mean, Grundlagen was written fairly quickly. He wrote it in response to a letter from Marty. He's like, look, don't just do all this formal stuff, write some introductory stuff, And actually in Grundgesetz, Frege writes that he jettisoned a complete draft previously. The reason why the implementation he writes in Grundgesetz appears so late after the announcement is owing in part to the internal changes with the concept script which forced me to jettison a nearly completed handwritten one. The scholarly view is, by some at least, Sundholm and others, that he had pretty much Grundgesetz already in 84, and he played around with it, and then he kind of realized something doesn't work, he jettisoned it, and maybe there was a kind of uncertainty yet exactly what his logic really looks like at the time of Grundgesetz. Okay. Of course, Grundgesetz is the finished product, right? So the whole, he writes the whole part of 2 as a test of his logical convictions, the whole system that everything beautifully works. And so we should, in a way, maybe interpret this invitation about sort of in the context of an intellectual development. Grundlagen isn't yet the final product. And actually, later on, Frege also writes this in his famous letter to Jourdain. I found it difficult to commit myself to the introduction of classes of extension of concept, since they did not seem all that secure to me, and as it turns out, I was correct. Indeed. But what that seems to suggest, he tried to maybe do without it, jettison it, and so at Grundlagen, maybe it's sort of just an element of hesitation, so we shouldn't read too much about it in terms of, okay, really what of course, the other thing people sometimes sort of note is that there's a kind of change from Grundgesetze to the Grundlagen to Grundgesetze, that now we're talking about value ranges rather than extensions of concept. I don't attach too much importance to this. I think this is just a general extension. So I don't think this is a sign you care about what logical objects are. In fact, extensions are just sort of a subclass of So I think there's something to be said about the first one, the kind arbitrariness objection. I think these two kind. I'm sort of thinking about both of these kind of responses. So what about the fact that he was aware that there could be a completely different extension that would do the job for him? So this is a classic passage in Heck where he raised this too. The explicit definition is in certain respects arbitrary, since numbers may be identified with a variety of different extensions or sets of possible objects or still other sorts. There is, for example, no particular reason that the number 6 must be identified with the extension of the concept is a concept under which 6 objects fall. It could be identified with the extension of the concept is a concept under which only the numbers 0 to 5 fall, or that of is a concept under which no more than 6 objects fall. These are kind of different kinds of extensions, so we have an arbitrariness. Now, again, it's like, well, even if that was true, only that there is some kind of arbitrariness in these kind of definitions. Well, look, that shouldn't be enough that he didn't care about which one it really is. After all, Frege, if you think that out of the choice of objects that he has that he could identify, there's actually some kind of rationale for picking out the ones that he picked out on, then you could say, well, look, he has a principle of reason. Why was that extension, not another? And I'm not going to go through all the details here, but with Roy, we wrote a little paper called Frege's Recipe in 2016, where we went back into Grundlagen and Grundgesetze, and we tried to do exactly that. We tried to get sort of a very general kind of recipe that you can apply just to all the different definitions that he does, that he provides, that actually helps you then, in virtue of that recipe, to justify why he went for that one definition. And this is a version of it. There's some kind of simplification. There's some kind of, there are other issues with this, but I think basically ultimately what this shows is that there is a way in which the way he defines it, there's actually something quite structured about it. In the discussion we can talk about this a little bit more. I don't want to get too geeky. Yeah. So in summary, I think Frege follows a very general method for identifying mathematical objects. Actually, if you remember in Grundlagen, he talks about direction, he talks about shapes, and then he talks about numbers, and that all really nicely fit the way you define it, actually. Basically, you define it, so direction of the line is identified with the equivalence classes of lines parallel to it. If the way you do that, then actually Frege's actual definition pops out as a result of this. So this is what we try to do. Heck in a postscript, and Roy and I are showing that this is the case in Grundlagen. And so actually, Heck is a little postscript where he now says actually it wasn't arbitrary, partly because there's something like this. And the same rationale doesn't quite apply in Grundgesetze. This is sort of our paper, but something very similar. But even if there was a little bit of arbitrariness here, let's just say this doesn't work. Well, why not have other consideration like simplicity or something like that that could actually override it? And I'm still thinking that this could be compatible with the kind of view that he wants. Good. So those are the first two objections. I'll say a little bit about the third, and then I want to get into the last sort of core problem. Hopefully, so this is Blanchette's claim that Frege actually had changing definitions. So imagine Frege comes along, in Grundlagen he has one definition of number, in Grundgesetz he has a completely different definition of number. He doesn't really care about that. He says, look, you can move from one to the other. Doesn't acknowledge it. How can you really be concerned about reference preservation if he just like moves along from one to the other? What's the difference? This is the difference. The definition that he gives in Grundlagen of cardinal number is that the cardinal number of the concept f is the extension of the concept equinumerous to the concept f. So basically what it is, the number of f is the extension of a second level concept holding of all first level concepts. That's the standard definition. In Grundgesetz he does it differently. He pushes it a level down. In Grundgesetz, the cardinal number of the concept f is the extension of the first level concept holding of the extensions of all first level concepts. So it's a quite different definition. And Frege is very clear that, you know, you go higher level and higher level, these are different kinds of objects, not objects, different kinds of functions. So for him, that would be a very different ontology if it was higher level rather than lower. So what's the response? Well, the first response is actually to deny that those definitions are actually different, that he actually intends them to be different. Go back to what Richard Hegg and Berge also said about the definition of what extension and concept that they're paraphrases. If they're paraphrases, what this means is that you can actually just pull this back down to the first level definition. So actually, it is really the same kind of definition. Again, in that kind of context, the alternative response would be to say, well, look, again, we can think about this in the context of Frege's intellectual development. He started out in Grundlagen. In Grundlagen, he doesn't have a specific logic. He just sets it up. He doesn't have, I mean, sort of prose, a little bit of logic, but it's not a formal kind of system that he has. And the new definition is really just a proper improvement on previous attempts at defining it. In the Grundgesetz, he gives you the proper logic. Now, here's one important observation, is that in Grundgesetz, Frege defines the value range operator to apply only to first level functions. So, strictly speaking, the Grundlagen definition is actually not well formed in Grundgesetz. Okay. So, his logic is very different. So, yes, he's given some kind of definition earlier, but now he moves to the right kind of logical system, realizes the previous one isn't actually well formed in my new system. So now he sort of, you know, adopts what's often this low-level reduction move, so he can always turn a second-level function as representable as in a way by first-level function. He has this kind of well-known passage, I think it's 24. So functions that appear as arguments of the form are represented by their value range. So the second-level function, you can always push it down representable via a first-level function. Pushes it all down, and then you only have to define the value range operator over first-level function. That's fine. It's a beautiful kind of system. It's a much better system. Does this mean that he doesn't care about the references? No. It means that he actually now has a proper system in which he can properly define the kind of objects, or clearly clarify what the numbers really are. So again, it's sort of, maybe it depends on where you're coming from, but I find all these kind of considerations about arbitrariness so far quite suggestive. I think if you think about Frege in sort of more general context, you can sort of alleviate some of these kind of concerns. So basically, my view on this is that, look, I don't think it's just an ad hoc change of heart, but Frege's new definition is actually motivated by the logic of Grundgesetz, and the suitability of the definition should be evaluated in the context of the wider system, and that's the one in Grundgesetz, and that's the one that, well, we're assuming it works, right? So, okay, so so now you might think, okay, Philip, man, you made it fly. Cool. This is a new, nice way of thinking about Frege. Interesting. Here's an observation, sort of just to audience members in general. If you ever, again, at a Frege talk, and anyone gives you a sort of scholarly talk about Frege, and there's no question, just raise your hand and say, but what about paragraph 10? It will always work, right? The speaker will start sweating, won't know what to do about paragraph 10. So paragraph 10 is a kind of passage in Grundgesetze that's just like, nobody really knows what's going on, right? And so, this is a slide. What the hell, Gottlob? I don't know what's going on. I really don't know what's going on. The problem is that he says certain things that are a real problem for my view. Okay? And you might think, what, this is coming now at the end of the talk? Well, it's coming now for a reason, because it's really difficult to say something about this. But let me say a couple of words about paragraph 10. So, in paragraph 10, there's a lot of going on, there's some kind of permutation arguments, and basically Frege starts out Grundgesetze with the true and the false, right? So you have the true and the false. Then he introduces extensions, and then he wonders, okay, so what do we do with the true and the false? Well, I'm just going to stipulate the true to be a certain kind of value range, and the false too. And then I'm going to show you that that stipulation doesn't harm the system. It doesn't render it inconsistent. Roughly, that's roughly what's going on in paragraph 10. Or at least that's what's intended to be going on in paragraph 10. There's a lot of other stuff going on in paragraph 10. Okay? But the kind of passage that is really problematic for me is that Frege writes the following. That is, without contradicting our equating, this is the basic law 5, it is always possible to determine that an arbitrary value range be the true and another arbitrary value range be the false. Let us therefore stipulate that singleton of the true is the true and the false is its own singleton. Didn't you just say arbitrariness? It's like there is no real arbitrariness. I mean, he defines the true arbitrary with some kind of arbitrary object. That just doesn't fit at all with what you just said about, what Frege's project actually is. Explain. So, I think there are a couple of things to say about this. I'm going to try some things out. The first thing to say about this is the definition that he gives here, note A, he calls it an arbitrary, I think, stipulation. Yeah, let's therefore stipulate. So, he stipulates the true with, by saying that, it's its own singleton. By the way, there's a really important footnote there, where he then also says you can't do that in general, but in this case it does work. So there's some interesting stuff going on in paragraph 10. But the important thing about this passage is nowhere in the actual language of the Grundgesetz does he actually introduce this definition as a definition. So when Frege gives a definition, he always has a sort of a double stroke of definition. That's his definition, say, of cardinal number. And then he gives a number of different kinds of definitions. He doesn't do that for the true. That's just happening in the metalanguage. That's just happening here, where he sort of gives a metalinguistic kind of definition of what the true is. I'm just going to treat it as a certain kind of value range. And then I'm showing you that this one. So there's a sense in which that definition clearly has a stipulation, has a very different standing in Frege's project than all the other definitions that he gives to say about cardinal number. So there's something odd going on. So I feel like the first thing that has to be said, because of this difference in the way it sits in Frege, it's not quite obvious that even if that was arbitrary, it doesn't mean that all the other ones are as well. It actually doesn't really make it into the system. Secondly, you might think if I'm defining the number 1 as a certain kind of value range, number 2 as a certain kind of value range, I'm giving you some kind of insight about what the numbers are, right? But if I'm defining the true by identifying it with the singleton of the true, that's not a definition the way you say, well, thank you very much. I didn't really know what it was beforehand, but now I do. So it seems like actually that definition, whatever it is, the nature of it is very, very different. Okay? He explicitly says in that context that it's arbitrary. Of course, it isn't completely arbitrary. There's some kind of restrictions on that. I think Roy sort of outlined what has to be the case. But note that he never really says that about any of his other definitions. So something different is going on in this kind of passages. I'm still struggling really to make sense of this. So if you have any cool, nice responses to this, I'm always like to hear and help me out. I think that's sort of the most challenging one at this stage. Now, it's also important to realize when Frege, again in this letter to Jourdain, this is a letter that he was encouraged to write by Jourdain for sort of an overview about his contributions to logic. Jourdain sent this letter and said, look, say a little bit sort of general things about how you did this and what the important things were. He actually starts his letter by saying the numbers though are objects, and in logic one initially only has two objects, the two truth values. So actually, as he does in Grundgesetze, he starts out with the two truth values. So it is then at a later stage, he writes, so it suggested itself to gain objects from concepts, namely the extensions of concepts as classes, and once I decided to adopt them, I made more extensive usage of classes than was necessary. But the thought is that basic two objects is the true or the false, then the truth value. Extensions comes after. So now to think as the definition of the true with some kind of extension, that this is something fundamental, I think that goes just against his general view. The true and the false was starting off. And what he kind of does, I think just to keep a system kind of simple, is introduce this kind of definition so that he only has to deal with value ranges. That's sort of my hunch. But not what that kind of downstream effect that has is somewhat questionable. So what to draw from this? I think it goes really against his convictions if you were to interpret paragraph 10 as providing a definition that really tells us what the true and the false really are. That really couldn't have been the aim of that definition. I think that is the aim, however, of the definition that he gives of cardinal number, for example. I mean, this is why he raises kind of, well, you're surprised this is what they actually are. That's what they really are. And maybe he provides a kind of stipulation as a sort of simplification rather than a genuine identification. I don't know, maybe some kind of a Satz object idea. I was briefly thinking about artifacts of models, sort of an idea that you had. It doesn't quite fit, but it doesn't seem like a genuine. What he does there, he identifies it for a certain kind of purpose, but he doesn't really attach a kind of ontological kind of importance to that specific identification of true value. So, conclude from this. So, I think all these kind of arguments against reference preservation, they all rely on arbitrariness. Pretty much all of them rely on, all the ones that are highlighted rely on arbitrariness. So hopefully I kind of managed to convince you why I think that this is important and interesting. I think the view fits really nicely with this overall Logicist project, and I think also these challenges can be met in some ways. It fits, for example, especially nicely with passages like this, fairly late in Grundgesetze, where he says, rather the rules here follow necessarily from the references of the science. And this reference is to the proper object, and this reference is to the proper objects of arithmetic. What is arbitrary is only the notation. So we really want to get after these objects. Right, I think I'll wrap it up here. Thanks so much.